They thought it was just another routine server audit. 3:14 a.m. An Amazon Web Services data center, unnamed, unmarked, somewhere in Northern Virginia. Cold fluorescent ceiling lights, the endless cathedral-like whine of industrial server fans. Engineers in neon vests shuffle down aisles of humming black racks. Barcodes, asset tags, clipboards, nothing unusual. Then a heartbeat, a single line in a kernel log that should not exist. A microscopic deviation in the power consumption of one Supermicro server board. Not a glitch, not a bad trace, a signal. It wasn't software. It wasn't malware. It was metal, a physical component, the size of a grain of rice, nestled deep within the motherboard circuitry, like a foreign species hiding inside the veins of a living organism, a spy organism. Engineers stare at each other like they've just seen a ghost inside silicon, because this is not supposed to be possible. Hardware is religion at this level. Hardware is sacred. Hardware is trusted because hardware cannot be invisibly altered without it being obvious. So, how do you hack something you can't hack? You manufacture the hack before the victim even buys it. Outside, the air is silent. But inside this room, every second suddenly feels radioactive. Security sweeps are called in. No one talks. Devices get shut down mid-analysis. People sign fresh NDAs in the hallway. Supervisors stop looking at logs and start looking at doorways, like something might already be watching them. Because if this is what it looks like, this is not just espionage. This is supply chain treason. And the implications hit like a bomb. If the implant is real, it wasn't placed here in America. It was placed on the assembly lines back in China, before the board ever left the factory, before it entered the U.S., before it ever booted its first BIOS sequence. It means intrusion didn't happen after shipping. It happened before manufacturing ended, which means this isn't a hack of a server. It is a hack of the global hardware supply chain. Chinese state actors, not breaching networks, but hardwiring their access into the literal skeleton of American infrastructure. Banks, cloud providers, defense contractors, even government labs. An entire ghost rootkit universe, embedded in physical copper traces, hiding in plain sight. And now a single question metastasizes through the room like an electric storm. If you can't trust the motherboard, what is left to trust? And more importantly, how long has this been happening without anyone knowing? Now we go backwards. Backstory begins next. Before the alarms, before the kernel logs, before the supernatural fear that silicon could lie, there was only the illusion of safety. The year was 2015. Cloud infrastructure was exploding. The new gold rush of a dematerialized empire, Amazon Web Services, was quietly becoming the backbone of the modern world. Apple was scaling global iCloud infrastructure. Defense contractors were beginning to move sensitive compute away from private racks into outsourced cloud capacity. Everyone was moving fast. Faster than the regulations, faster than the paranoia. And in that velocity, one assumption sat at the center of everything. That hardware was neutral, pure, untouched, apolitical. Supermicro, a company few outside the server world had ever heard of, was everywhere inside this new architecture. If you trace the lineage of global data, almost all roads passed through their boards at some point. They were the anonymous OEM giant behind the curtain. Their motherboards were in AWS. They were in Apple's data centers. They were in Department of Defense contractor networks. So invisible, they were nearly mythological. And China knew this, because the motherboards were assembled in China. That single fact, that small logistical detail, would later appear in hindsight like an unlocked backdoor left open for years. But in real time, nobody stopped to ask how dangerous it was. Because efficiency had beaten paranoia. The U.S. believed naively that hacking only lived in software, that hardware tampering was too complicated, too expensive, too time-intensive. Why would anyone go through the trouble of modifying chips? Engineers would say, because most people pictured hacking like they pictured crime, messy, unscalable, risky. But China does not think that way. Chinese intelligence has a different religion. Scale. They don't hack one company. They hacked the process that makes all companies possible. You don't break into one network. You break into supply chain and let the world plug itself into your ghost. And so while Washington was focused on malware signatures, a quieter, colder game was moving inside factories. Electronics assembly lines, PCB test benches, firmware burning stations, places no NSA intrusion detection system was watching. The BI tools that track global production flows show a pattern. The motherboards pass through multiple subcontracted plants in coastal China, the exact regions historically tied to PLA-linked manufacturing programs. It would later be alleged that microscopic implants were inserted during that loose, subcontract-oriented phase, when thousands of boards were being etched, soldered, QA'd, boxed, and prepared for export. And then, just like airport luggage, they disappear into cargo logistics. Shipped, imported, installed, trusted, thousands of servers powering U.S. infrastructure, carrying the seeds of someone else's sovereignty inside them. This is a psychological horror at the center of this case. There was no breach, because there was no outside. The hackers were already inside the hardware, before the hardware ever left the factory. As the U.S. intelligence community would later piece together the puzzle, their language shifted. They stopped calling this spying. They started calling it hardware interposition. The idea that if you control the heart of the supply chain, you don't just collect data, you shape history. Because the difference between software espionage and hardware espionage is the difference between watching a lock and forging the lock itself. And in 2018, America still believed the lock was real. It still believed the skeleton of its data empire. The servers were innocent. They were not. They were already infected. Now, we move into the main body where the hunt begins. The hunt begins. The official version of this story says the breakthrough happened in 2015. Unofficially, the trail starts earlier. Somewhere between 2014 and 2015, U.S. analysts monitoring industrial network telemetry noticed a strange statistical anomaly. Encrypted outbound packets originating from cloud compute instances that had no reason to be talking to certain foreign networks. It looked at first like noise. Every large network has ghosts in the logs, failed handshakes, broken TLS, no routes, collisions, junk. But this wasn't junk. These outbound pulses were perfectly timed, uniform, rhythmic, not random, not accidental. Like something was beaconing. And here's the terrifying part. When engineers wiped the machines, reimaged them, rebuilt the OS from scratch, the pulses came back. That is when the room went cold. Because only one category of threat behaves that way. Hardware-level persistence. A ghost below the BIOS. Below firmware. Below the operating system. A ghost burned into copper. So AWS called in the quiet people. The ones who don't wear name badges. The ones who don't appear on corporate org charts. They brought in a team who understood what 9% of the world does not understand. How to reverse engineer a motherboard. When they finally put one of the suspect Supermicro boards under high-power microscopy, they saw it. Something was there. Not a chip. More like a parasite grafted into the circuit traces, sitting between the baseboard management controller, the BMC, and the rest of the signal pathway. A sliver, a speck, so small you could lose it in carpet fibers. And if someone didn't know exactly what to look for, they would never see it. There are entire careers in cyber where nobody ever touches hardware. People think hacking is strings of shellcode on a screen. People think security is signatures, policies, firewalls, ML models, CM dashboards. They forget a motherboard is not just a board. It is a sovereign nation made of copper, silicon, crystal timing sources, voltage regulators, and firmware logic running the BMC. The one component that can turn on or off a server even when the main CPU is asleep. Control the BMC, you control the machine. And this implant was sitting right next to it. Interception, signal manipulation, data funneling, not through software, through physics. Now imagine the implications. Amazon panics. Apple panics. A contractor for the Department of Defense panics. Because if this implant is real, Then Chinese intelligence has a backdoor not into one network, but into potentially thousands of servers powering some of America's most sensitive digital infrastructure. This was a moment U.S. intelligence finally made a mental shift. This was not hacking. This was manufacturing-level infiltration of global trust. A supply chain compromise so clean, so ambitious, so mathematically elegant, it bypassed every American cyber doctrine. Because if the motherboard itself is compromised, there is no security team left to defend anything. The victim doesn't know they're already dead. But now, here is where the story becomes even more destabilizing. Supermicro never admitted this happened. China denied everything. Amazon publicly denied it. Apple publicly denied it. Supermicro publicly denied it. But quietly, servers were pulled from data centers. Motherboards were replaced. Silent internal reports circulated at Pentagon-adjacent circles, the ones that never leak out into the public world. And U.S. cyber doctrine began to change behind closed doors. Suddenly, the national security threat was no longer just malware. It was a factory. It was a subcontractor. It was a warehouse manager in a coastal Chinese city soldering an extra trace on a board that would later live inside a classified U.S. cloud environment. This is where the stakes mutate from espionage into something closer to sovereignty warfare. Because whoever controls a hardware supply chain controls the future. This was the moment the U.S. realized it wasn't just behind in manufacturing. It was dependent on a rival nation for the skeleton of its computational empire, a rival that was beginning to weaponize physics itself. And this was only the beginning. What the implant actually did here is the piece almost nobody outside deep hardware circles understands. This implant did not need to be complex. It did not need to run custom firmware. It did not need to contain storage. It did not need to think. Its job was not to be a computer. Its job was to be a switch, a shunt, a microscopic physical gate that altered electrical signals that already existed on the board, specifically those flowing into and out of the baseboard management controller. That tiny component didn't hack the BMC. It rode the BMC. Because the BMC is the most dangerous chip in any server. It can read memory. It can read firmware. It can control the CPU. It sits on an isolated management network. It bypasses SSH passwords, MFA. Every login mechanism the implant was allegedly designed to do one simple thing: modify command sequences so that the BMC would occasionally execute extra instructions that would never appear in normal traffic logs, instructions that could quietly open a persistent covert, channel to the outside, meaning the implant didn't contain the backdoor. It pointed the backdoor at the right place. Think of it like a secret valve welded into a water main, not a pump. The infrastructure around it already moves pressure. All the valve has to do is open at the right moment. This is why it was invisible to software scans. This is why you could wipe a server, reinstall everything, even replace the entire network stack, and the ghost would still come back, because the ghost lived in metal. Hardware-level espionage is the oldest kind of espionage. There were KGB typewriters with hidden RF transmitters in the Cold War. There were deep-cover microphones inside rotary telephones. But this was the modern equivalent. Except now the battlefield wasn't audio. It was computation. And this is a part that shook certain senior NSA analysts to their core. The implant was scalable. This was not the kind of hack you use for one target. This was the kind of hack you deploy like a global seed library. You plant it once into a manufacturing pipeline, and the global market distributes it for you. It gets shipped to Apple. It gets billed to Amazon. It gets integrated into defense contractor clusters. It ends up in the backbone of the most powerful country on the planet, and nobody questions it because the invoice looks normal. There is no secret crate, no smuggled briefcase, no covert cable splicing, just legitimate product, already compromised at birth. And here's the cinematic irony of it. Supermicro boards were popular because they were cost-effective, a tiny margin advantage, multiplied by thousands of procurement departments, led corporations to choose the boards with the greatest attack surface. This was not hacking. This was capitalism weaponized. And because these servers were powering cloud infrastructure, China wasn't just spying on data. It was spying on the meta layer, the layer where companies store, who is talking to who is deploying what, where compute is migrating, which firms are scaling, which networks are being provisioned. This is intelligence on the behavior of the digital world itself. And if you know how the world is behaving, you can shape what the world becomes next. Some U.S. analysts began calling this strategic telemetry exfiltration. The goal wasn't to steal documents. The goal was to steal the future. Because history is not written in words anymore. It is written in data flows. And someone, allegedly, had mapped the bloodstream. Now, the next phase of the story, how the U.S. responded behind closed doors.